Hi, I'm Kurt Granroth, and on today's episode of Granworks, I'm going to build this, a fidget spinner, with my son.
Hello.
Yeah, I think you'd be forgiven if you didn't ever hear of these if you're not, I don't know, a preteen. But apparently in the preteen set, these are pretty much all the rage. And literally all they are is something that spins. That's it. Well, simple enough. And my son and his friend wanted ones, and they wanted to make them. So I thought, why not? Let's do this. The goal was for my son and his friend to do the vast majority of the work, so I just handled the potentially dangerous bits. That included resawing this scrap piece of wood into two halves closer to the 7mm needed for the bearing. I don't know what kind of wood this is. Maybe walnut? Next up is planing down each piece to be the precise depth required. I knew it was 7mm, but wasn't really aiming towards the measurement itself. Instead, the idea was to plane it down to roughly the right thickness and then start sneaking up on it by comparing the actual thickness to one of the bearings that we were going to use. When they precisely matched the same thickness, we stopped. I then had each of them create cardboard templates for them to follow, but, well, they ended up being mostly for visual reference than anything else. The initial idea was to create the circle shapes using whatever size physical item they thought was proper, and then I would just cut them out on the bandsaw. As we'll see later, we scrapped that idea. The bearings at the center of all this are bog standard 608 skateboard bearings. They have an exterior dimension of 22mm. That's just a whisker under 7/8 of an inch, and I did have a Forstner bit with that size. Alas, that slight difference did put more strain on the glue than I preferred. So I ordered an inexpensive set of metric Forstner bits, which included one that was precisely 22mm. That's what we used here. That done, the next step was to drill out holes of various sizes to try and approximate the look we were going for. That meant 4 smaller holes to create a spiked effect for my son, and 3 larger holes on the way to creating a kind of wing-like extension for my son's friend. It was around this time that I realized that the 2-inch hole saw that I had lying around was almost exactly the size of one of the fidget spinners, and since using that was far easier than cutting out custom shapes on a bandsaw, well, I just convinced both of the boys that that was the more prudent way to go. The spinners work best with some kind of weight that's closer to the outside diameter as possible, and I figured that number 8 washers would work well for that. Press fitting those into spinners required a 3/8 inch hole. I used a twist bit right here, which did work for this particular one, but, well, off camera, it ended up splitting part of the other. Using a 3/8 inch Forstner bit was a far safer and more precise option. Lesson learned. In ways, this project sometimes felt like a 50-50 mix between drilling holes and sanding. So much sanding. I flipped my belt sander upside down for general shaping needs, and then corners were done with sandpaper wrapped around the dowel. And then all fine sanding was done by either a sanding block or sometimes just a strip of sandpaper on top of a table. There was basically 80 grit for shaping, 150 grit for initial smoothing, 220 grit on some surfaces for finishing, and then 400 grit for the final stuff. Anything that we wanted super smooth. Okay, now it's time to glue the metal bits in. Epoxy is the traditional adhesive used for this, but since I wasn't sure how long any of this would take with 2 hyperactive boys doing all the gluing, I decided to go with a tube of Loctite Universal adhesive. It's gel-like for filling in gaps, kind of like the epoxy, but it has some of that cyanoacrylate or super glue in it to bond very quickly. Plus, as a bonus, you can just put the cap back on and then use it later. As mentioned earlier, the weights were number 8 nuts. A nut was first pressed into one side to start, then glue is dabbed on the inside, and then the other is pressed on from the other side. The idea is that the glue would permeate throughout this and keep both nuts in place. I mean, they likely would stay in place even without glue because of the tight friction fit, but, you know, better safe than sorry. The finish we used was clear shellac. This could have also used some kind of oil, but, well, I didn't have any variant of that on hand and did have the shellac. Plus, And you know, boys aren't known for being incredibly patient, and super fast dry time of shellac is definitely a plus in that regard. I just love how the shellac makes the grain of that wood pop. That's what I was thinking as walnut. It's just so gorgeous with the finish applied. Anyway, the boys applied 3 coats of shellac with a light sanding of 400 grit in between coats. These fidget spinners could have been done right here, but the boys decided they wanted some caps to hold on to. It's their project, so let's do this. I started by cutting out 4 1-inch blanks from the leftover piece of the scrap wood. Then the original plan was to connect the 2 caps with wooden dowels, and so I created a shop-make dowel maker jig that, well, didn't work quite as expected. This is a piece of poplar, but a similar test with the walnut behaved exactly the same. The jig did work with an official dowel I had lying around, but it didn't work well enough. So then I tried to make a dowel by spinning the blank in a drill while running it over a belt sander. That almost worked, but getting it to a very specific size and a consistent size proved to be, well, not worth the effort. So a custom-made wooden dowel was out. The new plan then was for the caps to be connected using a piece of 1/4-inch steel rod that I had left over from a previous project. My first thought was to use my angle grinder to cut off the 2 necessary pieces, but then decided that an old school hacksaw would, well, maybe be more fun for the boys. Neither of them even knew it was possible to cut metal with a handsaw, so yeah, they were having a ball. One side of the rod was glued into one of the gaps using just a dab of glue. This was also a relatively tight friction fit, so not a lot of glue was needed. Now, had the idea to use a custom dowel worked, then that would have been made to friction fit in the bearing. The steel rod, though, was a good 1/16 inch too skinny, so it needed to be shimmed up. So many ways of doing that. Tape works. After the spinner is press fitted onto the tape covered rod, I just use a razor blade to cut away any excess. The top cap was then glued onto the rod the same way the bottom cap was. The rod was intentionally left long, and so I used a combination of a hacksaw and good old pliers to nip them off just a hair above the caps. That hair was then ground down using the belt sander until it was perfectly smooth and flush. At this point, I would normally be showing the caps being finish sanded and then having shellac applied. But the boys saw the time it would take to do that properly and convinced themselves that it looked great as is. Okay, like I said several times, it's their project. And if they're happy, okay, they're happy. Alright, what do you think?
Very cool. They're really good.
Are they close to your original designs at all?
Oh, sort of. They look rustic. I was kind of wanting it to have more than 4, but actually it looks. I think it's better than I wanted it to be.
Yeah,
It's I
really
think it's
cool.
way better than regular fidget spinners that you would just buy on Amazon.
Yeah.
Also, it's really
The
fun
cheap
making them.
plastic ones.
It's really fun making them too.
Yeah.
Alright.
Thank you.